Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have Brandon DaCruz back on. We were just talking, man. It's been, I thought we had you on a solo episode, like more recent, but it's actually been since, what would we say, December 2023 on that. Time freaking flies because I swear I had you on before that, since then. But we've done many coaches roundtables with you and Jeremiah as well, too. And obviously you were one of the main. I mean, you were. I feel like you were on what at least five times, like a lot at the beginning. We went over a ton of topics. So obviously everyone knows who you are here at this point on the podcast. But if you aren't, Brandon DaCruz back on, man. Again, good to have you on. Looking forward to chatting with you today.
Absolutely, Jeff. It's good to be back. I think that initially, especially when we first started podcasting, I used to be on like every month, and I think that we have like this hindsight bias, but life gets busy, and luckily for us, we've both been incredibly blessed in terms of our businesses growing and just evolving, and also we keep in contact off air, and so that's something that oftentimes I know as a podcast host myself, with the guests that I just kind of bring on just for guest interviews that I don't speak to, I'll always remember the last time I spoke with them on the podcast. But when you interact with a friend, every few months or you check in or you catch up with them, you often kind of confuse the off-air conversations that you've had with them with the actual on-air recordings that you've released for the public. So it's an interesting situation to be in, but I'm always, gracious to be on here. I appreciate you having me on, and I look forward to diving in and giving some insight and some valuable info to your audience as always.
Yeah, man, absolutely. And also we get to meet up. Again, this will actually be the second time.
Sir.
North Carolina next week. Are you looking forward to that seminar at the FNMS? Sam and I have talked about this. That never rolls off the tongue well at all.
We just got to go with the full thing, the functional nutrition and metabolism specialization.
Even that.
Yeah, it's a little bit much to get out, but no, I'm definitely looking forward to that. First and foremost, it's been a long time since we've met up, my friend. So it's been since Nashville, since the Physique Education Collective in June 2022 that we linked up. That was my birthday that weekend. But also, I'm really looking forward to getting into Raleigh, North Carolina, and meeting up with Sam, with Brian, with yourself, and then the other members of the Metabolism School team, because that's been a great investment that I've made this past year. And that was a recommendation by you. So I thank you for that. But I'm always trying to get around like-minded individuals. And the longer that I do this, I'm 15 years into coaching at this point, and I'm sure you could relate. It gets more and more difficult to find valuable and trustworthy resources of information. So luckily, I have a research background. I had a 10-year career in the sports nutrition industry where I did research and development. But a lot of times I'm spending hours upon hours digging into PubMed or Google Scholar myself to be able to tease apart research studies and really be able to take away practical applications from them, but then to be able to work with someone that's all they do, someone like a Brian, which is behind the scenes at Metabolism School. It's really cool to have that back and forth type of dialogue. I've been very fortunate as well. Like Lyle McDonald and I speak almost on a daily basis, and that's someone that he is very theory based, and it's just been an amazing friendship and working relationship that we've been able to establish, because I'm a very curious individual and I want to learn as much as I can. I'm always looking to learn more so I could serve more, and it's really good that we have different groups like that, but we also are able to put ourselves around other coaches, other fitness professionals that share the mindset and the belief in pushing ourselves further and raising the standard of this industry, because that's something that I'll tell you, 15 years in this, man, the industry has become more and more saturated, but it's not more saturated with good people. So when I can find a group, when I can find individuals like yourself and Jeremiah, who we've created a friendship over the last 6 years, that we've been super close and been there for a lot of our greatest memories and accolades and things like that. I remember one of our coaches roundtable was when you announced that you were gonna
That's
pop
right.
the question to Ali.
Yeah.
The same thing with Jeremiah. I was on a podcast with him, and he right after that he went and proposed to Katie. Like, these are like cornerstone moments in our lives that we've been able to see with one another, and then also cheer each other on from the sidelines in terms of our business accolades and our client wins and things like that. So that is something that it goes way past just the success of a business itself. So these are things that I really look forward to, and I'm very much excited to get into Raleigh next week.
Yeah, man. No, it is, because like we love this stuff, but like, it is. I feel like it is hard to find people that are like as into it as we are about it, right? So it always is good to chat, and then also too, like, again, I'm sure you feel this way with having other people on the podcast and whatnot. Like, it is always good, like you said, to get other views and get other people's thoughts on things. I think that can be super helpful to kind of get you to rethink things. I know for me, that's been the coolest thing with the podcast, is like having people on to get me to question some things that I thought, right? I mean, even chatting with you and Jeremiah at times, like there's been times where I'm like, damn, I didn't even really think of it that way. And I think that's super cool, to be able to do that and everything like that. But, it also can get lonely when you run your own business.
Yes.
So it's nice to have those, people that in your industry to chat with, and again, like you said, bounce off ideas, and just to again have that friendship, man. I think it's super important. The more I learn about humans, like we need that. We need those relationships and stuff like that, and that's super important.
Yeah, we're tribal beings. And so if you actually look into some of the longevity research, a lot of times we, from a health and fitness perspective, will think about the blue zones, which there are some confounding variables and modifying factors that kind of challenge that literature and that research. Eric Trexler's done a lot on that in terms of the record keeping might be inaccurate. But regardless, if we look at some of the markers of longevity, it's grip strength, it is lower body strength, it is like walking speed. But people are looking at muscle mass markers or performance markers. But another massive component of longevity are two things: purpose, having a sense of purpose. So we actually see that when people retire early, they are more likely to die within a shorter time period because they've lost their sense of purpose, especially if work or their career or their outlet was their profession. And then the other thing is social connectedness, which doesn't mean you have to have like a fucking huge tribe, but it does mean that you need to, the people that are important in your life, you have to stay connected with them, have social connections, have dinner, break bread, have communal bonds with individuals that you can bounce off of. And that's a massive portion of health, like total health, not just physical health, not just mental health. This is spiritual health, emotional health. And so these are things that within entrepreneurship, it is quite lonely. Like, think about, I worked in a corporate field for 10 years. I ran a team for a massive supplement company. I had people that were with me in an office on a day-to-day basis. A lot of times I did do travel by myself because I was the main representative. But even so, I would go visit other accounts. I'd be at expos. I'd be able to interact with people. As a business owner, luckily, like, I built a community of my clients. But besides that, it is quite a lonely endeavor. I'm very fortunate that my partner actually does the same thing that I do. She's a health coach herself. So we're able to, every single night, we have a routine where it's phones away, computer and laptop off, no email, no social media, no notifications. And it's just us de-stressing, decompressing, and venting to one another. And I found that to be incredibly important, but also having friendships. Like, it's been great to have you. It's been great to have Jeremiah. It's been great to have some of the many coaches that I've been very close with and good friends with, because it can be, a challenging endeavor when this is not only your life's passion, but it's also your profession. And that's something that many people can get burnt out of. And so, I'm 15 years into this. I want to make sure that I can do this for another 15 or 25 or 35 years. And so being able to connect with like-minded individuals, or go to these expos, or go to these conferences where it's small group and you're able to interact and really bond and connect with other individuals, I think this is something that's not only good for our business. Like, a lot of people think of just like, hey, what can I do from a revenue perspective? What's my ROI? I don't really think in that terms. I'm thinking, what type of impact can I have by having these people in my circle, in my life, the influences that they can give to me, and then the positive influence that I could give on to them.
Yeah, and that that was a challenging part, during like COVID and stuff. It was harder to do those types of things there. So like being able to get back to that, I think is it's awesome. Like you said, it's super important. And anytime I've gone to any event or anything like that, you always meet at least at least one person that I feel like you kind of connect with that you didn't before, and that that leads to other things down the line, which I think
Absolutely.
is great. So you're someone that I love learning more, and I feel like you might be one of the people that enjoys it more than me, and does just as much, if not more, than me when it comes to continuing education.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, is there anything recently that you've kind of dove into, or anything that you've been interested in, or anything like that, or any sort of new research, or just, I guess it doesn't necessarily have to be new research, but things maybe you're just diving into a little bit more potentially?
Yeah, Jeff, you know me well, and you know that I'm always doing something education wise. I think the real reason behind that is I'm always trying to emphasize to my clients, and honestly to other coaches that I work with, is that this industry is constantly evolving. And I've been in this long enough to see many life cycles come in and out. And so the research is always changing, the methods improve. And if you're not continually learning, you're falling behind. And I've seen, because I've been in this space for so long, I've seen many other people that were colleagues of mine, or just, fellow coaches, that have fallen by the wayside because they haven't kept up. They have stopped investing into themselves. So I really believe that if you want to be the best coach possible, you have to continually invest into yourself and into your education. And I see this from a two-pronged approach. It's not only important to upgrade your skill sets, but I always think about it as I want to do unto others as I want done to myself. So if I'm expecting clients to invest into me, to help them become the best version of themselves. I also want them to know that I'm always going to be investing in myself and I'm always looking to learn more so that I can serve the people I work with more. So just give you a little background of like this past year, it's been a massive investment into education. So back in June, we were just covering the functional nutrition and metabolism specialization certification. That's a 6-month program. So I finished it up in June, and that is through Sam Miller's metabolism school. And I don't know, have you spoken in depth about that course, Jeff?
Not in depth, but I've had Sam on a couple times, but I don't, necessarily say that I don't like specifically talk about it regularly.
Okay, so I'll give my opinion. I thought it was a very well done course. It's an in-depth course, and it really, for me, it was a great example of helping to bridge the gap between evidence-based practice and functional nutrition. And although they covered many topics that I was well versed in, say like blood work analysis or hormones, being able to interact with guys like Brian and Sam on a more personal level has really been invaluable because, like I was mentioning previously, at 15 years into this, the longer I'm into this, the longer I do this as a career, the harder and more difficult it is to find reliable sources of information that I can learn from. I have to be a lot more specific and selective about what I take on because there's so much misinformation and disinformation. Besides the FNS course, I'm currently enrolled in, I'm actually finalizing my sports nutrition NIST accreditation with the Sports Nutrition Association, which is based out of Australia and New Zealand. But I have a lot of international clients, so I wanted to get certified and accredited overseas, which I already do have. I have an accreditation for a nutritionist accreditation that's in around 70 countries, but I still wanted to go the extra layer deeper and get a sports nutritionist accreditation. So that's been like a huge amount of like investment of my time and energy, but it's given me an even stronger foundation in evidence-based sports nutrition. So this is more body composition management, sports performance, things like that. I was very fortunate because I have a background in supplementation. Those things were just like kind of a recap or review, but for people that aren't really good with supplementation, this course is great. And then beyond just like formal education, I was mentioning to you previously, I've literally spent like dozens of hours with other educators, with other mentors, and specifically with Lyle McDonald. And honestly, Lyle is like one of the sharpest minds in nutrition science. And so having the opportunity to have many discussions with him, both that we've recorded, I've probably released like 10 2-hour-long podcasts with Lyle over the last few months, but there's been many conversations that we just have, him and I don't ever release to the public. Being able to bounce ideas off of him, pressure test theories, and then really dig into the nuance of topics that I'm really interested in. So that could be metabolic adaptation, that could be GLP-1 receptor agonists, that could be fat loss, long-term weight loss maintenance. We've had some really deeply critical thinking conversations, and it's just been able to help me create a more fully unified theory. He's very good with the theoretical. He's very good with research interpretation. And then I'm able to give him feedback on how does this apply in the real world. So for instance, we've went back and forth on rapid fat loss diets. And like I'm able to tell him from my own experience, having run rapid fat loss and also run it with clients, what I'm really seeing in practice from a biofeedback perspective or from the decrements or the consequences of some of these types of approaches. Whereas he's looking at it from the X's and O's. What is nutrient sufficiency? What nutrients do you need? What electrolytes do we need to backfill? What omega-3 fatty acid ratios do we need? Like he's very hands-on with that type of stuff. So it's just been an immensely beneficial friendship that I've been able to do. And then beyond that, it's really just spending as much time in the trenches coaching other clients. Like none of this, I research like 2 hours a day. I do continuing education at least 2 hours per day. It's an hour in the morning and at least an hour in the evening. But none of this would be worth it or none of this would really be of value to me if I wasn't applying it on a daily basis. And really with every course, every conversation, every hour I spend studying, it gets distilled into strategies that produce better outcomes for my clients. Because really at the heart of coaching is, I want to take an evidence-informed approach, but I also want to get results. And so it's not just about reading papers or quoting studies. It's about bridging that scientific knowledge with lived experience, with ongoing education and practical application, as I really do think that knowledge without application is useless. There's many, many intelligent people in this space, but if you can't actually help people integrate it in the real world, those strategies, those methods, or even, the types of approaches that you're discussing, there's a lot of things in the space people are talking about this type of training modality or this supplementation or this, nutritional ideology. And it's like, it's all good and well. Those they theory craft, they talk about theories and they're talking about these interesting studies. And it's like, but how would you apply that to someone in the real world that has 3 kids, they have a job, they're super stressed, they hardly get any sleep? Like when push comes to shove, can you really apply that to the vast majority of people that would come to you? Or do you even work with people? And that's really what it comes down to. I'm always trying to look at very specific populations, really trying to find data and research and evidence that applies to the people that I work with.
Yeah, I mean that's the hard part, right? Like again, you can get the information, but then like you said, how do you apply it? And I feel like with that too, a lot of times because I made some posts about this recently. It's like people will throw out certain methods, whatever it may be, and it's like there's no context behind it, right? I
Mhm.
think that that's largely missed as well too. Of like a lot of things can work, but it's like how do you like you said how do you apply that to that person? And again, I think when it comes to research, like it's those are just it's going to help you get in the ballpark, but like you said, you really need to be able to take the individual that you're working with and apply it to them. And like you said, that's the challenging part, and most people do overlook that part of it.
Absolutely.
As far as F and was there anything there? Because again, I know that you came into it, you have a ton of knowledge, but like, was there anything that you felt like you got out of that in particular, or is it just kind of again just like you said, really bridging that gap between like you said, functional nutrition and metabolism?
I think the ability to have support calls on a weekly basis, that was the most vital part. So if you were just to take the modules themselves, I think they did a phenomenal job. But I always have to take it from the perspective that I have went through so many educational courses. I have a background in this. I've went and got an advanced diploma in nutrition science. So my education background is different than most. So if you were just someone that was, I don't want to say newer in the space because they're not covering the basics. They're not covering macros or how to write a meal plan. Like they're not going to teach the fundamentals for a coach that doesn't have a very strong foundation. But I will say that the support calls have been the most advantageous for me. And then also now being in the mastery program, that was something that you had advised. And I find those calls to be the most interesting, but also the most beneficial. Like for instance, right now I'm going through the whole coursework and I'm almost done with all the mastery calls. So I've almost caught up. But obviously I got through the course fairly quickly. And so the last few months I've been going through all the mastery courses and it's like, all right, I have a lot of clients coming to me on HRT and these are things I'm familiar with, but I also want to know their perspective or how they're looking at these things. I'm very good with blood work analysis. I've done hormones for a long time. I've also worked with both enhanced athletes at the highest level in terms of the IFBB, but also people that are on hormone replacement, but even things like peptide therapies. Let's look into the actual literature on this. This is something that many people overlook. It's like, I want to do for my clients the best job possible to educate them, to give them informed consent. A lot of clients are coming to me and they're asking, hey, I'm going to this clinic for my HRT and they've proposed that I take this, and this peptide. And it's like, that's not approved for human use. Like this is like a research grade chemical. And so it's just been really advantageous to have those conversations or even that portal that we can look into certain things and see how other practitioners are looking at things. And then it just kind of sparks my interest. Maybe I'll take a citation or two. They don't really like cite their work, but I'll take some of the things that they talk about and then I'll go into PubMed and I have more search bars and search like key terms than you can imagine. So I essentially always have papers being sent to my email. So it's just, it's a good amalgamation of things. I also think that it's a great resource in terms of I took 15 years to learn all this information from all these different things. I went to seminars all over the country. I would fly out, I learned blood chemistry I had to fly to Texas the first time I learned blood chemistry, and it was a blood chemistry for athletes course. And it's like, all right, so I took a 7-hour flight. I spent multiple thousands of dollars during a weekend, and then I had to go back for continuing education to up my like CUs. I could have learned that in this course. Now, obviously I had that background, but it's really advantageous to have it all in one spot and with people you actually respect. Sam is someone that I respect his integrity, and that's a huge thing for me as well. It's not only who can I learn from, there's a lot of intelligent guys in this space, and I have the utmost respect for them, but I may not respect how they go about not only disseminating information, but also how they go about delivering it, and then also their methods of business. And so I have to be aligned from an ethical and moral perspective because Brandon DaCruz Nutrition is an extension of who I am as a person. I don't want to align with certain people, regardless if they have the best information in the world. I really want to connect with people that I can morally and ethically see eye to eye with and say, all right, we're really trying to push this industry forward. It's not all about the dollars and cents. It's not all about the return on investment. Yes, we have to make a living, but it's not about screwing people. And there's a lot of people in this space that are handing out cookie cutter protocols and making themselves sound like they're a guru that knows way more than they actually do when they don't even have the understanding of first pass physiology, and they're doing so to pad their pockets. And that's something that it doesn't sit right with me.
Yep. Yeah, like you said, I mean, like you said, the industry is saturated, but it's not necessarily saturated with good coaches, and figuring that out it is tough. But like you said, you connect with the right people and everything like that. So yeah, man, I totally agree. Yeah, Sam and Brian are great, and love their program, and so I'm glad you've enjoyed it as well too. So what I want to switch to is kind of talking about your most recent fat loss phase. I'm just curious what you did, how it went, and yeah, I love just kind of chatting about that stuff. I got your Instagram post pulled up, so got some notes to kind of go off of here. But yeah, man, fill the audience in on your fat loss phase.
Yeah, so this was actually the perfect timing for us to do this. And I know that we scheduled this a couple months ago, but
Yep.
I'm right at the tail end. So I'm in week 15 of what will be a 16-week fat loss phase. And my goal wasn't just to get lean, it was to push myself close to photo shoot condition while testing some of the methods that I often talk about. And one of them specifically is something that we've done a full-length podcast on years ago, which was my high energy flux approach. Now, the caveat here is that I usually will use a high energy flux approach with myself and clients after a fat loss phase ends so that I can get ourselves or them specifically into a upregulated state where they're able to eat more because they're moving more and they're still able to maintain a healthy level of leanness. But this year, I decided to try a very high flux approach where I tried to create a substantial portion of my daily deficit through increasing activity rather than slashing down my food intake. So instead of pushing my calories down as low as I usually would, and now, Jeff, you've known me for many years, almost every year I get very lean. And so I push myself. I have a lot of data on this. So I know exactly what like my baseline is or where I need to take myself because I have files upon files upon files. I've done 15 shows over the years, 100 plus photo shoots. So I know what usually is my threshold in terms of what calorie intake do I need to get to a specific level of leanness. So this year, instead of doing that approach that I normally would and undulating my calories down and taking them down, I have a pretty adaptive metabolism. So usually every 1 to 2 weeks, I'm using a calorie cut. I decided to essentially ramp up my daily activity and movement and my structured cardio so that I could eat more while I was getting lean. So to achieve this, I set a baseline of 25,000 steps per day, which I achieved by taking advantage of several forms of movement. So when I got to 25,000, this required me to commit 2 hours per day to treadmill walking at a low intensity. And how I did that was I did 1 hour of fasted cardio every morning and then an hour midday, which was obviously fed. And I would just divide that out and I budgeted that every single day. And I thought about it logically. I have obviously files from when I used to compete. Now at that time, say like my first contest prep was in 2014, the literature on NEAT was not around. So I used to do 2 hours of cardio back then, but then I compensated. Like when I look back in retrospect, I compensated because I didn't stay on my feet the rest of the day. I was doing 2 hours of intentional, say, zone 2 cardio, so it was at a lower intensity, but I was also making sure that I moved throughout the rest of the day. So there was no compensatory behaviors that would downregulate my energy expenditure. So I did those 2 hours of cardio every single day. I did post-meal walks after 4 of my meals. I would usually go on a 15-minute walk, which would just be outside to get some sunlight exposure, set up my circadian rhythm. It's very good for digestion. So if we look at some of the literature on post-meal walks versus prokinetic medication for decreasing gas and bloating, they show like equivalent results. And then I also, when I would be in the gym, I would take laps around the gym in between sets. So I did not sit down. And then what I also use was, obviously as online coaches, Jeff, you can relate to this. We spend a lot of time sedentary. We're on a desk most of the day, whether it be with calls or for you and I, we're doing podcasts or even just doing client check-ins. So what I did was I used a modified like Pomodoro method where I would set a timer, and I'm still doing this. The only time I'm not going to do this today is because I'm on a call with you. But every 15 minutes that I was at the computer, I'd get up and take a 10-minute walk on my walking pad. So I literally have a walking pad right outside this door, outside of my office, and I would just get on there and I would, get onto my phone and maybe do some emails or do some social media or whatever it may be. But I would take that 10-minute walk and I was intentional about that. So throughout the course of the day, I work very long days. So I was getting at least a minimum of 100 minutes of walking just on a walking pad, but very slow. So it's a small walking pad. I have a very long stride. So it wasn't anything like a super high intense. It was just like in between work blocks essentially, but it kept me sharp. And then on the nutrition side, I kept protein intake very high. So I averaged at least 1.5 grams per pound of body weight per day. And then I also incorporated protein hyperfeeds where I pushed my protein intake up to 2 grams per pound on certain days. And I used this high protein intake approach, not only because I was getting very lean and I wanted to preserve lean mass, but I essentially wanted to create a caloric funnel where my energy expenditure levels were heightened due to protein's higher thermic effective feeding. So I figured if I was going to leverage a higher intake of any macronutrient, let me do it with the macronutrient that had the highest thermic effective feeding. Beyond that, I built my diet literally all around whole foods. So when I do the calculus, like I did the calculation, I was using 95% of my food was whole foods. So that was coming from lean protein sources, fibrous carbs, veggies, and fruit. And really the idea was I wanted to maximize satiety per calorie, but also the calorie burn from the thermic effect of feeding is much higher when food quality is higher. So if we look at, there's a research study by Barr and colleagues, they found about approximately double the thermic effect of feeding and the amount of calories burned when utilizing a whole foods meal as compared to a processed meal. And so I was trying to look at every single vector that I could to essentially squeeze out more calories and increase my calorie burn. Then beyond that, I used a calorie cycling approach, which I often do. We discussed my last fat loss phase on I think it was a coaches roundtable that we did last fall. Last year, I did a little bit different of a calorie cycle, but essentially I always calorie cycle where I'll eat higher calories on my training days as compared to my non-training days. But this year on my non-training days, what I would do is I made even larger of a discrepancy. Oftentimes on those non-training days, I would run like a rapid fat loss day, which is essentially a modified protein sparing modified fast, which allowed me to keep the deficit moving while still fueling performance. On my training days, my calories would be well over 3,000. And then on my non-training days, they'd be like 12 to 1,400. So it was very low, but pulling all these levers allowed me to get lean while keeping my calorie intake far higher than I usually diet on. So for example, in many of my previous fat loss phases, and we've discussed this on, man, like years ago when we would do podcasts on like some of our phases, I usually have to get around 1,800 to 2,000 calories to get very lean. Now, this time around, I was able to get to around the same level of leanness, averaging 2,800 calories per day. And there was just 2 weeks throughout the entire course of this 15-week phase thus far where I really needed to push myself because I saw my rate of loss slowing, or I wanted to get ahead, like on in terms of my progress and accelerate my rate of fat loss. And then I had to get down to a net, across the week intake of 2,500 calories. So I'm looking at between a 500 to 1,000 calorie difference in calorie intake this phase versus others I've done, which is pretty considerable when you think about it. And it's allowed me to stay far more satiated and to feel better in training than I usually do at this level of leanness. Now, what's interesting about that is I still have some of the consequences of being this lean. So sleep is still disrupted. So I'm not going to paint a picture like this is all good and well. I do have massive sleep disruption when I get probably below 8% body fat. And this is how it's always been every single fat loss phase I've done. It doesn't matter if I backload carbs in the night, if I utilize a fructose source, if I utilize melatonin and certain sleep supplementation. That is something that has always been fragmented for me. But I will say from a subjective perspective, my day-to-day energy levels have been far better. My perception of diet fatigue has been far lower. And also my training performance has been far better than it has been just because I'm really able to fuel. I'm utilizing nutrient timing approach, utilizing a lot of probably 60 to 70% of my carbohydrates are coming in the pre and post workout window. Also, I train very early in the morning. And so I'm front loading a lot of my calories and I find that my satiety is enhanced. And we actually see that in calorie shifting studies. If you look at the Jakubowicz studies, there's a researcher named Daniela Jakubowicz, and this is mostly in women, but she finds that when you utilize in a deficit, a calorie shifting approach where you front load a larger breakfast as compared to a larger dinner, you have greater satiety throughout the course of the day. Because think about it, in the fasted state, you have nothing in your system and you're going to be most likely or most hungry in that state, although we see that hunger hormones are greater in the evening. But if you're able to suppress your appetite starting in the early part of the day, you go less of the day without hunger. Whereas if you were to backload a lot of your calories in the evening, which is what a lot of people do, you're only staying satiated for like 2 or 3 hours before you go to bed. Whereas if you did that same, so in her study, she looks at like a 7, 3, and 500 calorie, across a day, or maybe it's 7, 5, 3. And so they'll look at women eating 700 calorie breakfast as compared to a 300 calorie dinner, and then do it vice versa, where they have a 300 calorie breakfast as compared to a 700 calorie dinner. And they find that the women that utilize the higher energy intake breakfast, they feel greater satiety, less hunger and less appetite. And then also when they looked at long-term blood levels of ghrelin, they actually saw a suppression of ghrelin or greater suppression of ghrelin during the trial and then 6 months later. And those women, not only those that were in the front-loaded group, they lost more weight, most likely due to adherence. It's not like an energy expenditure type of thing, but they lost more weight and kept more off. So these are just some advantages that if you get really into the nuances of meal timing, nutrient timing, calorie distribution, and then also, obviously, my energy intake, the thermic effect of feeding, the food quality. I was even leveraging things like nuts. Like if you look at the Atwater values of almonds, if you look at almonds versus almond butter versus almond oil, there's a massive discrepancy because the fibrous matrix of an almond, you cannot completely absorb that. So you don't, when it comes down to net metabolizable energy, you lose about 20 to 32% of those calories in the digestion process, you essentially, it comes out in fecal matter. So even things like that, I was leveraging to increase energy expenditure as much as possible. So I kind of looked at fat loss equation this year instead of looking just as like a calorie budget. And I'm going to take away from the budget in terms of I'm going to create a deficit from almost all food, which I do advocate. But the thing is that I also get a lot of feedback about the constrained energy expenditure model. And right before I went into this, I did about a month deep dive into the energy constraint and the energy compensation model. And I did a massive, it was like a 3-hour podcast with Lyle McDonald. And I just wasn't convinced. And years ago, you and I had a conversation about this, and I wasn't convinced then. And I was even less convinced in the real world application of that once I got into the nitty gritty research, looking at both sides of the equation. And I really think that it's just very specific to Hadza, like the hunter-gatherer tribes, and then really high-level endurance athletes that are doing immense amount of workload. Because I'll tell you, I did not find a constraint, and I was doing 25,000 steps a day.
Yeah. Well, I mean, you also didn't have to drop your calories either. I feel like that's probably a huge piece of it, right? I feel like when a lot of people
Absolutely.
tend to do that, right, they're going to do both. They're going to, go up, do a ton of cardio, increase their steps to 25, but then also try and drop their calories super low. And it's like, I could see where, the body's, something could happen there, but you're able to show that, hey, like you could just increase your movement and you didn't really have to make a big decrease from a caloric standpoint. Well, at least a big of an increase or decrease
Yes.
as you did in the past there. But throughout this, you mentioned a couple things you said was like, the nuances, but I feel like, when you hear all these things you're saying, it's like, even if it's someone that maybe isn't as advanced as you are, like there's a lot of things that you could apply to their fat loss phase where it's like, hey, what works best for you? And here's how we can leverage this, right? So it's like, if it's the meal timing thing, well, again, you can leverage that for someone who maybe isn't as advanced as you are. And it's like, you can set them up to basically, you can set them up to have a potentially more effective and efficient fat loss phase if you're setting these things up right. Whereas if you take someone where you don't focus on meal timing and you have them eat all their calories later at night, it's like you're not they're not necessarily set up, I feel like, to succeed as well. And there's a little bit more that they have to do. Like they're kind of going uphill a little bit to see results. So like for you, it seems like everything you were doing was getting you to where it was almost smooth sailing downhill, right? Like you were just set up to have more effective and efficient fat loss phase. And I like how you said it's an equation and you were putting all those things in there to balance in your favor, the energy outside of things and the energy inside of things.
Absolutely. So what we have to realize is that energy intake and energy expenditure are intrinsically tied. And so, for instance, when you make a massive reduction, we've done a full podcast years ago, Jeff, on metabolic adaptation. We've covered reverse dieting. We've done a lot of podcasts together. And so I've covered some of these topics in depth, but really what ends up happening is when you make a massive deficit. So say that I was to take myself and put myself in a massive deficit to elicit the amount of rate of loss that I wanted to hit and also the level of leanness. So now I'm getting hit by two sides of the axis. Metabolic adaptation is dictated by the amount of total weight loss that you lose and the size of the energy deficit and the length. And so regardless, if you lower calories significantly or you lose a lot of body fat, you're still going to have the repercussions or the consequence of metabolic adaptation. There are still diet-induced metabolic adaptations. So like I mentioned, I still face the sleep loss, some of the lack of energy and stuff. They weren't as bad. So I could say on a gradient scale, they weren't as severe as I've experienced previously, but there's by hook or by crook, if you're getting very lean, you're going to experience these things. There's, I always say this expression, for every gimme, there's a gotcha. And there's a cost to getting lean, regardless of the way that you go about it. I just tried to find a different method to go about it to be able to give another option, another road. There's many roads to Rome, and I just want to give other people that. And here's really what it comes down to. I've used this high energy flux approach literally hundreds of times over the years to keep people lean. So it's not just to get them very like shredded. I haven't taken people into photo shoot shape or contest prep doing this. But I will say that there have been specific individuals that have come to me over the years that are an endurance athlete or a cyclist. And I've put them into a high flux state and kept their food high and really manipulated different variables. So maybe I keep them in an isocaloric diet, but I change all their food sources. And I really leverage that thermic effective feeding. And I dial in their meal timing and their nutrient timing. And they're having exponentially greater body composition change. I'm seeing body recomp. I'm seeing fat loss at an expedited rate. And it's things that most people are not going to see, but I've had a very specific population that I'm working with of high achievers, high performers. And then also I have a deep interest on the science. So there's many variables, whether it be from a nutrition standpoint, a training standpoint, a supplementation standpoint, that I'm pulling these levers that I'm pulling. And when you're able to take a multifactorial approach, you can really dial things in. I always say this, when it comes to intermediate to advanced trainees that are trying to get to that next level, attention to detail makes all the difference. Now, is this for everyone? Absolutely not. Most people will not need to get into the nuances, but I'm 20 plus years into this. This is my career. This is my life's biggest passion. And so I feel that as a nutrition professional and as a coach, as a physique coach, I need to trial these things on myself to be able to collect data because I am probably one of the most objective people. Now, and I don't say that from a subjective standpoint. What I mean by that is my previous career was in data collection and essentially interpretation. So I used to do research and development behind supplement companies and supplement formulations. And one of the things they always had me do was alpha test our products. An alpha test is the first person that tests the products or the first group. So a beta test, a lot of people are familiar with. A beta test is like that secondary group, which may be ambassadors or athletes. I was on the ground floor with a lot of these products. And the reason they did was because when they would do independent testing on me, I was not susceptible to the placebo effect because I'm very objective and I have taken every single supplement using the scientific method. When I tested beta alanine for the first time, I did it in an isolated fashion. It was the only other thing that I added into my supplementation protocol. I undulated and titrated up the dose into the sustained dose. I did the same thing with sodium bicarbonate. I don't suggest anyone does that because you'll be in the bathroom for days at a time. I've done that with all different supplements with different theories, with different methods, with approaches, and I have so much data on myself that I wanted to test these things all together. So I don't want to call this a kitchen sink approach, but I said, all right, I've utilized all these different approaches and there's data behind them. So for instance, when I looked at 1.5 grams per pound of body weight per day of protein, that was just reinforced by a recent 2025 meta regression by Martin Ruffalo, Eric Trexler, and Eric Helms. So I had done a full podcast on that. I was very familiar with that. And that's something oftentimes just from my bro bodybuilding days, we used to use like 1.25 to 1.5 grams per pound. The protein hyperfeeds I got from a good friend of mine, Alan Aragon, who I've done conferences with. I've also had on my show before. That was something that he used to use in place of refeeds. And so when I was starting to feel like the ravaging effects of, because believe me, I felt greater satiety, but you're not feeling the absence of hunger. That's not what I'm trying to get across. You get down to very low levels of body fat, you're going to feel that. So there were times that I could tell from my biofeedback that I was starting to wane a little bit. I'm getting down to lower percentage of body fat. I had a few days where I had very low sleep, so I would compensate for that with actually using high dose creatine to offset some of the cognitive issues that come along with that. But then I might throw in instead of a refeed, a carbohydrate refeed, I would do a protein hyperfeed where it would be 2 grams per pound. So I'm looking at over 400 grams of protein in that day from whole food sources. Now that was incredibly satiating. And then other aspects that I did with the food pairing and with the nutrient timing and things of that sort, these were all just trying to stack the deck in my favor. But like you mentioned, these are approaches that we can utilize singularly or stacking one or two on top of one another. You don't have to go full gambit on this, but it is something that from an experimental standpoint, I really did want to test it. You can refer to the audience to my photos. I'm very lean at this point, and it's been, comparable to what I've done in the past. I just haven't suffered as much.
Which, you can't really get any quantitative data on that, right? That's
Absolutely.
more just that's the biofeedback side of things. And if you feel better and you can get shredded doing it, like you said, no matter what though, body fat's going to be that factor that's going to, at the end of the day, the leaner you get, you're going to run into issues, right?
100%.
Some people are going to be able to handle it a little bit better than others, and genetically, whatever it may be, right? I know we've talked about that in the past too, but yeah, that's always going to be there. But you were still, if you felt better in that process, like I think that's super important. I feel like a lot of people do miss out on that piece of it. It's like, I mean, how do you actually feel doing it? Like if you feel like it's more sustainable for you, you felt better, then that's a win in my books, right?
Here's the thing for me, man. I'm going to be honest with you. I don't want to call upon this as like discipline, but I've been through brutal preps before. I've been on a DEX of 4.7% body fat. It isn't like a testament that this was something I needed to do, but what I did want to see was how would my performance be in the gym as compared to when I am hungry, when I am depleted. And I will say from a performance perspective, my performance stayed pretty high until the last 3 to 4 weeks of this fat loss phase. So within the last 3 to 4 weeks that we're at right now, and that's confounded by multiple variables. I was moving, so I was getting ready to move, and I was not sleeping well at all. I had a lot of things going on personally with my family and just some things that were outside of my control that was keeping me up at night. So I wasn't sleeping well, and I was getting leaner and leaner by the week. And with that, I started to notice as I got leaner that obviously my leverages would change. So a lot of the bigger compound movements, I honestly should have shifted and done more machine-based movements and things of that sort, but I wanted to maintain the same training program throughout the entirety. So I started to lose reps. I started to notice that my range of motion was having to elongate, especially on something like an incline bench, just because I have less back fat, I have less chest fat. So I did lose performance towards the end, but you're going to lose performance regardless. I will say that I maintained performance and strength for a much longer period of time throughout this process than I generally do. I felt subjectively much better in the gym from an energy standpoint. And then also I had much better pumps, and not that pumps are related to anabolism. When people talk about like the pump is an indicator of growth, it isn't. That's from cell culture studies. That's from a 2010 paper by Schoenfeld in the original mechanism of hypertrophy. If you actually look at those papers that he cites, those are in vitro studies. So those are cell cultures. However, there also is a portion of this that is about, what do you like? Do you like having a pump in the gym, or do you feel like you can't connect with the muscle and really know if you're actually isolating or really targeting that portion of the musculature if you're completely flat and you can't feel anything? Because I'll tell you personally, as someone that competed 15 plus times, when I would be dead flat in a prep or in a photo shoot prep and I could not feel my muscles, I couldn't pose. So it impacted me subjectively. It impacted how I looked in the mirror. It impacted how I felt, like some of the adjustments, because I coach myself. And so sometimes I'd be like, maybe I need a refeed. And then you have to talk yourself out of it. Like, I would always remind myself, in order to lose fat, you have to go flat. But this time around, I was able to have better connections, better pumps. And it's not that pumps are everything, but it was a
It's a good
much better
sign.
subjective feeling in the gym. Hey, I'm targeting this specific area of my muscle, this specific region, and it's working as it should be. So it was a more enjoyable process, and I think that that goes far as well.
Yeah, I think the performance, man, is super important. Like, I think if you can protect that in the fat loss phase, especially for somebody like you that is getting lean, I mean, you're in a good spot. But as you said, the leaner and leaner you get, there's probably going to be some decrements, and then on top of it, you kind of mentioned a few things there too with your performance dropping. And I think people forget about this, right? People are just very quick to be like, oh, I'm in a deficit, so performance is dropping. And I always kind of push back on that of like, is it the deficit, or is it, could we manipulate something from a meal timing perspective? Is it your sleep potentially, right? You also mentioned you had some other things going on from a stress perspective. Like, people don't realize how that stuff can really impact your performance. And then obviously when you're in a deficit, all that stuff is heightened anyways, on top of it.
Yeah, I think we really have to consider the impact of your allostatic load. So if we actually just look objectively speaking at the literature on the impact of an energy deficit on strength performance, there's a meta regression by Murphy and colleagues, which a lot of people cite. It's something like energy deficiency impairs lean mass gains.
Yep.
However, a lot of people will cite that as this paper that showed that over a 500 calorie deficit, you will not gain lean mass and you're more predisposed towards losing lean mass in an energy deficit, even if you're resistance trained. Great. There's another portion of that meta regression, that meta analysis, which looks at strength progression. And they found in most resistance training studies, even in a deficit, there was strength progression. Now, that can be confounded by multiple things. That could be neurological gains. So if someone had just started a training program at the beginning of a deficit and now 6 weeks in, they're in a deeper deficit. However, they're also more neurologically and neurally adapted to that specific movement pattern. They're getting stronger. However, we don't see a one-to-one correlation, as in, you go into an energy deficit, you lose performance. That's a lot of mental. There's a lot of mental aspects to that where people automatically think they should be weaker. But if you have lost a significant amount of fat mass, you will lose fat around areas that will impact a lot of usually compound movements. So something like a bench press, something like an incline press. The reason for that is because if you're losing fat off, say, your chest and your back, now automatically, even if you were doing the same amount of weight, you're actually lifting more because the range of motion is longer. So if you think about the actual range of motion for a bench press, if you've lost an inch or two off your chest and an inch or two off your back, the range of motion has increased for 4 inches.
That's a big amount too. Doesn't seem
It
like a
is.
lot, but it is a
It's
good amount.
substantial. And so even if you were to look, that's why I like to sometimes have clients look at like their power to weight ratio or like their strength to weight ratio, because there's a Wilks score that they use in powerlifting. And it judges you by what is your weight class. So if you were, and these are always in kilograms, but we'll use, our system. Say you were 220 pounds and you got down to 190 pounds. If you're lifting less, you may still be lifting more per pound in a specific lift. We need to look at that. Are you still as relatively strong as you were previously,
Yeah.
but you've lost maybe a rep or two off of a movement? You shouldn't see a complete cratering of your performance. You should try to be able to maintain your top loads, but you may need to shift into a lower rep range. So what I did personally, as I got deeper into this fat loss phase, was I had movements that are my key performance indicators. So that's an incline press, a dumbbell flat press, things of that sort. They would usually be for rep ranges of 7 to 9 or 6 to 8, somewhere in that region. I just shifted them down. So now I'm doing 5 to 7. So I'm giving myself a little bit of a smaller bracket in terms of the actual rep range target, but I'm still pushing myself to maintain that top end strength so that when I do increase food and I do get, a little bit more leverages back and I regain body fat, I can shift right back into it. I haven't lost that ability or even just like the confidence of myself. Like, yes, I can lift this heavy weight.
Yep. Yeah, no, that's super smart. Like, yeah, being able to maintain that. And then, like you said, using the power to body weight ratio. Yeah. That I didn't even think about doing that before, but that can be super helpful. Like you said, because if you're losing weight too, like that's obviously going to impact things there. Well, a couple things though that you've said here throughout as well too, that I think is again, when we look at how you set things up, a few things that kind of came to mind were you said you did something where you moved more throughout the entire day, right? And again, I think from like a metabolic health standpoint and everything like that, like that's, kind of what the research shows, right? The more that you can have those kind of small movements throughout the day, like that's going to be better for that. And then the other thing that I noticed too that you said was you did front load your calories a bit more. And when we look at circadian rhythms, like that's kind of how you'd want to line it up too, right? Because same thing when we look at like blood sugar, insulin sensitivity, things like that, like, that kind of lines up with that as well too, where it's just not as effective later in the day or as efficient later in the day. So you kind of lined it up as well too there.
100%. If you look into chrono-nutrition research, there's a great researcher named Frank Shear, and he looks at the same calorie load meals done in the morning as compared to the night, and they shift people's schedule essentially. And we see that beta cell function is something like 17 to 20% greater. So beta cell is what releases insulin from the pancreas. So your beta cell function is about 17 to 20% better in the morning. Your insulin sensitivity is somewhere in the realm of like 10 to 20% greater in the morning as compared to the evening, even when these are calorie and macro equated. Now that discrepancy or that difference between your insulin sensitivity and your nutrient partition in the morning as compared to night can be exacerbated even worse if you are someone that's macro hoarding towards the evening. So we're talking about in these research studies, they're looking at the same calorie controlled meals. So the same protein content, same fiber content, same carbohydrate, fat, and calorie content in the morning compared to the night. And they're seeing differences and that there's advantages to the morning shifting or the morning feeding of that. Now, if we were to take that to the end of the extreme, and I do see this sometimes in clients' blood work and in certain metabolic health profiles that come across my desk. Those that usually backload their eating patterns, often not only are they eating more calories, like say that they're hoarding a lot of their food for the end of the night, oftentimes, and we've had this discussion, I remember I said this to you one time and it kind of like stuck out to you. I don't know anyone that binge eats in the morning. It's always at night where you kind of fall off, you come home, you're stressed from work, you've had a long day, and you sit down on the couch and there's a lot of cue conditioned eating, meaning that we associate different routines in our day with different types of activities. So in the morning, maybe you're someone that's active like myself. I see my treadmill, I know I'm getting on there and getting a fasted walk in. In the evening, a lot of people look at their couch and their TV as a time to Netflix and chill and eat some hyper palatable foods. And so they may have that evening meal where they backload a lot of their calories, but then they're eating in a compensatory manner on top of that. And so now they're having blood sugar dysregulation. We know that there's an inverse relationship between insulin and melatonin and also cortisol and melatonin. So now you're having these implications on your actual hormone secretion from a circadian rhythm perspective, the diurnal rhythm of some of these hormones. And you're also putting yourself in a disadvantageous position to actually partition and, take those substrates and actually put them and sequester them in muscle tissue as compared to fat. So these are just some, advantageous methods. It's not to fear monger anyone, but these are simple swaps that I've had people that have insulin resistance that come to me that are type 2 diabetics. And I say, all right, this is what we're going to do. After every meal, I'm going to have you do a 10 to 15 minute walk to help with lowering the area under the curve of insulin and blood glucose elevations from your actual meals. Then what we're going to do is we're going to front load most of your carbohydrate and your protein early in the day. And especially your first meal, we're going to utilize a very high protein bolus because there's something called the legacy effect, where the second meal after a first high protein meal, you actually have a lower blood sugar and insulin excursion as a result. Whereas those who fast during the morning, they actually have a higher insulin and blood sugar excursion for that second meal if they had lunch by itself and they fasted in the morning. So there's these little things, these meal timings or these nutrient pairings that we can utilize to really stack the deck in the favor of someone that wants not only physique optimization, but health optimization. And that's always been my motto. Like I coach through a health-centric model. And I always say that a healthy body is a responsive body. And that comes with optimizing your internal systems first and foremost to be able to optimize your external outcomes.
Right. I mean, like you said, like we don't want to be neurotic about it. There's, again, you don't want to fear monger around these things. But again, if somebody's struggling, like these are things that you can do to just, again, make it an easier process on a process that for some people, especially in today's modern environment, and depending on what they've done coming into it, it can be very challenging, right, to do these things. And so we're just kind of like you said, stacking the cards in our favor or stacking the deck in our favor. Well, and you did mention this earlier, but you didn't mention this here. And you were talking about people eating late too. And I have seen this. And so I just kind of want to get your thoughts on it. But you did say ghrelin typically is higher in the evening as well too, right?
Yeah, so we see the research. I've actually gotten this from Alan Flanagan, had done some work on this for his dissertation.
That's where I saw it too, was Alan.
Yeah, so I remember him delivering some information. He was doing a big breakfast study, I believe, and this was for his PhD. And he had cited that ghrelin levels are higher in the evening, but that can also be entrained. So we have to think about it like this. Ghrelin is actually entrained on your meal timing. So ghrelin is a hormone. It's the main hunger hormone. It's the only gastric released hormone that increases hunger. Now, ghrelin is entrained by our meal timings and our patterns. So for instance, you'll actually notice that your ghrelin entrainment will change during two different times in your life. First and foremost, if you go to an intermittent fasting pattern, you'll initially get those hunger pains earlier in the day when you're skipping that early feeding window. And eventually, as your body gets entrained, you get used to it, you'll stop experiencing that hunger. And this is why ghrelin is essentially a meal initiating hormone. So if you notice, about 30 minutes to an hour before all meals, you feel some type of hunger pang. And that's because ghrelin is being released from the stomach. It gets released during sleep, it gets released in fasting conditions, and it gets released before meal times. So if you are someone, and this is where there's a confounding variable, which I would love to dig into the research, maybe I can reach out to Alan and get the citation he was referencing. But in my own mind, just as a critical thinker, I think to myself, is ghrelin just naturally higher in the evenings, or were there participants in that study used to eating later at night, so they had a higher release of ghrelin based on their normal eating patterns? Because we know, based off the research by Sachin Panda, that most people eat about 15 hours per day and eat a very large percentage of their calories later on in the evening. So he has a very large study, Sachin Panda, who has done chrono-nutrition research on the average American meal timing patterns. And the average American eats many times a day. We're not talking three square meals per day, but they also eat around a 14 to 15 hour window. So we're seeing a very large amount of calories in the evening, especially after like the dinner time period. And so that's different than other cultures. So I would imagine, say that you went to a culture that generally eats early, you may see ghrelin levels in that culture be lower because they're taking their dinner in at 5 o'clock in the evening and they don't have any exposure to food at night. So now at this 8 o'clock pattern, we're pulling ghrelin. Ghrelin is already back down to baseline because they had a satiating meal at 5. It suppressed ghrelin, and they're not used to snacking at night, because we do know in snacking studies that those who snack regularly will have a ghrelin increase before their usual time. So I would imagine, we can just use this colloquially, everyone has that 2:30 feeling. I would assume that many people in today's population and society, especially in the general population, they get a 2:30 or 2:30 ghrelin release that you and I don't have because we eat on a very regulated and routine meal schedule.
So essentially what you're saying is, it sounds like, well, you're saying that potentially it could just be a trained type thing of that's just how people typically eat. And so you're going to get that ghrelin response because you typically will eat at that time. And that could be partly why those people's ghrelins were higher when he cited that paper, right? Is that kind of what you're saying?
I don't remember him saying that. What I'm saying is, from a physiological like plausibility perspective, that's what I would think. And then also there is some data that does show that. So there's data on within day energy deficiency when they look at different distributions of calorie intake. So within day energy deficiency, this is a subsect of low energy availability and relative energy deficiency. And there's two studies, one on male athletes and one on female athletes. And they look at different hormonal markers in individuals that are in energy balance, but they're utilizing different calorie shifting approaches. And this is actually observational. So this isn't like they put people in randomized control trial. But what they found was there were certain athletes, endurance athletes and soccer players, who would skip morning feeding and train. So they created a large within day energy deficiency because not only were they fasted, but then they created an energy deficit. And then they backloaded their calories at night. And in that study, especially in the women, they found higher ghrelin levels at night and also higher cortisol secretion at night. So it kind of disrupted their actual hormone and their hunger signaling, despite the fact that throughout the course of 24 hours, when we looked at 24-hour energy balance, they both ate the same amount of calories and they were both at energy balance. But the distribution of those calories impacted the actual expression or the release of those hormones.
Yeah, the more I learn, man, like, obviously we know calories matter, but the more I learn, it's like, man, meal timing really is a very utilized tool, I feel like. And I do feel like it got kind of brushed, like with people that really push calories and macros. Like, I feel like it kind of got brushed to the side of like, oh, it's just as long as your calories and macros are in check, you're good. But man, I'll tell you what, meal timing, I feel like really does play a huge role. Again, at the end of the day, what you eat is super important. But again, to go back to what we've been talking about this whole time, if we really want to set you up and stack the cards or the deck in our favor, it's like, man, meal timing is definitely something that I think is just overlooked.
I'll give you one additional piece of data that reinforces what you're saying, because I agree completely. I think what is ended happening is that, I'm going to give a hat tip to Brian Borstein, created this concept of evidence-based nihilism. And essentially, I think that that's happened in our space that people have become nihilistic, that nothing matters. So we have kind of a dichotomy of things. So when it comes to nutrition, people are like, protein timing doesn't matter anymore, nutrient timing doesn't matter anymore, meal timing doesn't matter anymore. Eat whatever you want, eat your calories, make sure you have protein and calories, and that's fine. It doesn't matter your carb and fat distribution. There are many holes and flaws that we could pick in that. But let's just, instead of me going down a diatribe, I'll go just to the meal timing. So if we actually look at literature comparing regular meal timing versus erratic meal timing on metabolic health parameters and energy expenditure, we find that when they put the same individuals in a crossover trial and they had them eat 3 square meals per day versus multiple erratic feedings, meaning that some days they have 4 meals, some days they have 3, some days they have 6, and also they're at different times, those individuals that were on the regular meal timing had a higher thermic effective feeding to those meals and better metabolic health from a blood sugar and insulin perspective and better insulin sensitivity. The body really wants to perceive and be safe in its environment. The same thing with energy availability. Let's think about the menstrual cycle. Women need to put themselves in a great state of energy availability to have reproductive function on a regular basis. If they're constantly going to and from, calorie excess to calorie deficits or slashing their calories and then fasting on different days, we see perturbations in energy availability within 3 to 5 days, or perturbations in LH pulsatility within 3 to 5 days of lowered energy availability. But when it comes to metabolic health, we find that those that maintain more regular meal times have greater beta cell and pancreatic function and response to those meals. So they're able to clear that blood glucose, sequester those nutrients, and partition them into where we want them to go rather than where we don't want them to go, which is in the plasma itself. And also, they have a higher increase in the thermic effective feeding to those meals as compared to those that eat erratically. So really, when it comes down to it, it isn't about people becoming neurotic with these things, but it's almost like what I try to get clients across the clients is like, how would if I could make these different these small adjustments to what you're doing right now, and I can get you closer to the result you want without really anything you doing. So no more time for your day. We're going to just schedule this. Every day you have meals at this time. We're going to switch around some of your food sources so that you're burning more calories, you're more satiated, and you're able to actually adhere to the plan better. Like, these are some simple adjustments that might sound like overwhelming at first, but we make these things and makes the process easier for you rather than saying, all right, it's just about calories and we're going to let you eat whatever type of calories you want at any time. And you're going to have these metabolic health implications. You're poor adherence. You're going to suffer with lack of satiety because you're eating all these processed foods, and all that matters is calories. No, because your food quality, your nutrient timing, all these things impact your actual satiety, your adherence, your ability to stick to a plan. And so they have downstream implications in the real world. And that's why it can't just be about the research or just about what looks great on paper. You could have the perfect macro calculation of these 3 macros and these calorie set, and this should be a deficit for you. But if it doesn't work in the real world where someone can actually apply it, they can adhere to it, and they can feel satiated and feel like this is a sustainable part of their lifestyle, it's not going to work.
Yep. Well, again, the modern environment just makes it just too hard, to be able to do that if you're not doing those things that we talked about, right? Like helping them set up with lower satiety, and all those things. A couple questions that I have on just some stuff that we've talked about here. So with the protein, again, we know that you can leverage protein, get thermic effective food. I'm sure this is going to depend on the person, but typically what can we expect from an increase in thermic effective food? And again, I know that it's probably going to depend on, okay, where are you coming from with protein, right? Like that's going to play a huge part in it. But what do you think we can expect from that?
So obviously we can expect an increase in the energy expenditure component. Now, there is a study about aloe vera that showed like a doubling, but we're talking minuscule. We're talking about going from say like 100 calories to 200 calories burned. I don't remember the exact figures, but I will say this. We do know that increasing the protein intake of the diet does spontaneously reduce other calories. So for instance, the best study on this is by Weigel and colleagues, and they took individuals and they put them in a run-in diet where it was at energy balance and it was a 15% protein diet. And then they increased them to 30% and they kept them at maintenance. So it went from 15% of their energy intake from protein to 30%, and they kept them at maintenance in both conditions. And then what they did was they put them into a 12-week ad libitum, meaning eat to satiety, eat to fullness portion of the study. Now, the only really clear delineation was they had to stay at 30% of protein. So at 30% of protein, they went into a spontaneous 441 calorie energy deficit and lost a substantial amount of fat mass across the course of those 12 weeks. So what I'm trying to get across is that we have something called protein leverage. It's a protein leverage theory, which means that when the protein is low in the diet, we will often overcompensate with carbohydrates and fats to try to make up for that protein percentage. And the average American's eating between 12 to 15%. But when we look at research on higher protein diets, especially those around 30%, we see greater satiety, greater weight loss efforts, greater fat loss specifically, because remember, it's not just about the weight loss in general, but also we want to protect actual lean mass. And if you're losing more fat mass by a macronutrient like protein, you're thus losing less lean mass. So it's a higher percentage of weight being lost from fat mass, so that's quality weight loss. Then also from a satiety perspective, you don't need to go as high as I went by any means. That's not what the literature shows. But if we do look at, a lot of people will cite, there's a study by Roberts and colleagues where it was like 1.8 grams versus like 2.8 grams per day, grams per kilogram per day of protein. And they had almost equivalent, it was a short-term study, almost equivalent like satiety responses. But if we look at Eric Helms, he has a master's thesis, and he looked at 1.6 grams per kilogram per day versus 2.8 grams per kilogram per day in resistance trained individuals. They were athletes. They found that diet satisfaction was higher, satiety and stress levels were satiety and diet satisfaction were higher, and then stress levels were lower in those that had the higher protein diet from a subjective perspective. So these are just little things that there may not be make or break, but it's almost the same concept of diet breaks. We don't see physiological benefits from diet breaks right now. We're not seeing a restoration of metabolic rate or leptin levels going up so much that they're offsetting some of the negative implications of diet-induced metabolic adaptation. But from a psychological perspective, they help with adherence, they help lower disinhibition, and they help with sustaining the actual deficit. The same thing can be said about protein. This is a macronutrient that's going to preserve lean mass. It's going to increase the thermic effect of feeding. So I look at it as creating a caloric funnel. If I'm going to use any macronutrient in excess, we know that it's the least likely to be actually essentially sequestered and stored as fat. We see that in Jose Antonio studies. It's the most likely macronutrient to be satiating. And that was something that I felt subjectively. I wasn't using a ton of protein powder. It was a lot of whole foods. And we know that harder texture foods are more satiating. So I was eating a lot of like chicken breast, turkey, things like that, which I had to chew, like egg whites, which are high in volume. So these were very filling foods. And I didn't feel the immense amount of hunger. I'll be honest with you. I never complain about this, but every time I get very lean, I deal with intense hunger, which often will really diminish my sleep quality. I still get the implications on sleep. When I'm lean, it's just like I'm like a raccoon in the middle of the night. It's early in the morning and I'm up. But I will say that I didn't have like these hunger pangs in the middle of the night that woke me up, which was, just a benefit as a whole.
Yeah. So, if someone's like looking at like, we shouldn't necessarily be concerned about, okay, how many calories is it going to add to our daily energy expenditure? It's just, again, mostly going to be, like you said, you get all the benefits of protein, the satiety, and we know that it can be used as a caloric funnel. Again, we don't want to necessarily look at it as how many extra calories you're burning, but just, all the benefits of getting protein in is really what's going to happen. And then as far as what energy expenditure you do get from
it's cherry on top.
You're just, it's just going to be extra, but really the main benefit of protein is going to be all those other things that you said. Plus, like you said, anyways, we need to get enough from a lean body mass perspective when we're fat loss dieting. What about the meal timing thing? What did they kind of show with that? Was it like again, are we talking a couple hundred calories? Are we talking like fit? And again, I know it's probably going to be an average for the people, but the thermic effect of feeding increases there on that.
Yeah, I'm going to be honest with you. I don't remember the percentages. I think I looked at that maybe like 5 or 6 years ago. I could definitely get you the citation and send it over to you, though.
No, you're good, dude. I just didn't know if you knew off the top of your head, because I don't know if I saw it from you or what, but again, I know it was same thing though, right? It's like we don't need to worry about how many calories. It's just like knowing that there's a lot of other benefits, I feel like, of keeping meals around the same
100%.
time and structured like that. And then again, that's just another cherry on top of it as well too, in terms of
I see these almost as like free 1%ers that we can stack on top of each other by itself in isolation. None of these are going to move the needle so much that you're just going to utilize a high protein diet and get shredded, or you're going to dial in your mealtime and getting shredded. But when we put in a whole foods based diet, which is highly satiating, you're getting the most satiety per calorie, you're getting a higher fiber content. So for instance, for every 14 grams increase in fiber, Hallworth and colleagues found that it spontaneously reduced energy intake by 10%. Now that didn't increase energy expenditure, but it decreased energy intake. The same thing with Weigel and colleagues going from 15 to 30 decreases energy intake. So we're impacting both sides of the energy balance equation. I still modified my actual diet, but I didn't focus on just cutting calories. I think that a mistake I see a lot of people doing from a fat loss perspective, and I do a lot of consultations. People come to me and they say, this is what I've done. I want to know about their diet history. Like, what have you tried? What has worked for you? What hasn't worked for you? I want to get a background on them. And a lot of times the methods that I find have worked the least effectively and often have backfired in actually what I would categorize as a failure, meaning they lost some weight, they regained all of it or even more, and then they often felt disgruntled, discouraged, and they were really thrown off course as a result, are methods that are too flexible in nature for people that don't have the skills in place. So what I mean by that is it's when you take just an if it fits your macros style and you had a piss poor diet to begin with, and then you just focus on portion control. Control is great because we all need to control our portions. We can eat anything, but we can't eat everything and anything in any amount that we want. However, if you have a very low satiety diet to begin with, and you've been eating in excess, which has been contributing to excess weight gain, if you take that same diet and try to put yourself in an energy deficit, you're going to leave yourself in a position that's disadvantageous for two reasons. You're not going to receive any satiety because this is a low volume diet, a low nutrient diet. But also, you're not only going to put yourself in a calorie deficit, but you're also going to put yourself in a micronutrient deficit, which is going to predispose you towards biofeedback dysregulation from satiety hormone perspective, a thyroid hormone perspective. A lot of these people come to me. I look through, like, I do a food intake and a nutrient intake analysis, and they're lacking zinc, iodine, selenium, all these nutrient cofactors that are necessary for thyroid creation, as well as the conversion of T4 to metabolically active T3. So they have a downregulation in their thyroidal axis. So now they're getting hit from lower energy expenditure levels because they look hypothyroid. They might not be getting sufficient zinc, so they have low testosterone. There's so many different things, implications that can happen from poor nutrient status. But really, when it comes down to it, if we're just able to dial in your food quality first and foremost, and then we can work on certain different vectors, we can really put you in the best position to succeed. And that's something that I look at everything. I go food first approach generally, but this time I decided, you know what? I'm just going to try this experiment. I'm going to go activity first, but I did place a heavy focus on my food quality. So obviously I still counted calories, I still tracked everything, but I kept my food much higher, but I made sure it was high quality foods. Everything was whole food. Like I said, 95% when I did, the only thing that I ate that was processed, and this isn't to demonize processed food, but I just want to get across the fact that I was trying to have the most nutrient replete diet possible, the most satiating diet possible. And I also was leveraging so much protein content that was contributing to my higher energy intake that I had to keep it mostly whole foods. The only thing that I had that was actually processed was protein powder. And these were a minimum amount of shakes, and I would do like a creamy or something that would, just kind of cap off my sweet tooth, essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, like you said, the diet's super important because, again, with these people that maybe aren't as skilled, they don't really understand what's going on. When you do get into energy deficit, the body is going to have some compensations that are going to lead you towards overeating. So it's like, if you're not aware of these things, you feel like you're not eating a lot. And the next thing you know, you're just getting it because, again, we're not setting you up to succeed. I feel like in terms of setting all the things that we talked about today. There, real quick, one last question for you. In terms of scale weight, was that kind of what you're going off of in terms of making sure that you're in a deficit, or do you kind of go off of any other metrics there? Because I don't know if this happens to you, but does the scale get a little noisy as you get leaner?
It does. All right. So let me explain. Yeah. So I do look at scale weight, but I find that scale weight is far greater of, first of all, I don't look at scale weight as the be all end all metric of tracking progress. So I just want to say that I know where my quote unquote lean weight is, and I'm usually trying to target that, but it's not make or break. In the initial portions of a fat loss diet, I use a descending and dynamic rate of loss, meaning I usually will lose more in the beginning. When my calories are higher, my body fat is higher, my motivation is higher, I'll push the deficit a little bit harder. Also, metabolic adaptation hasn't set in. So I created 1,000 calorie deficit off the bat. I truly have 1,000 calorie deficit, which we know, quickly gets narrowed down because the energy gap closes due to metabolic adaptation, due to compensatory behaviors, things like that. So initially I do look at scale weight, but once I get to under 10% body fat for my body in particular, now mind you, I've been under 10% body fat dozens of times, I do notice that I'm more susceptible to fluid shifts and scale weight deviations day to day than I would be at any other body weight. And that happens from multiple components. So first and foremost, if I have a bad night of sleep, I see water retention on my physique and on the scale. So I'll have an increase in water weight. If I go multiple days without very low carb diets, so there was times that I did run to lower my energy deficit. I would run 3 rapid fat loss days in a row. Now that is just trace carbs. So we're talking 30 to 50 grams of fiber-based carbs per day. I would notice that my scale weight would go up. Now, that is for two reasons. Now, you would think, hey, you're eating 12 to 1400 calories, you're in a massive deficit. How is you gaining weight? That's multifactorial. A, it could be from cortisol elevations because I don't have insulin, I don't have carbohydrates secreting insulin to lower that cortisol. But also, we have to think about gut residue. When you go into a lower carbohydrate diet, you have less essentially waste to excrete. Let me just say that. So your bowel movements slow down. And essentially, Eric Helms and I had a conversation off air where he essentially said that he'll notice, besides on refeeds, that he will be losing at an exponential, like at a great rate, but as his poos slow down, his rate of loss slows. But he knows it's just gut matter. So it's like gut residue that you're increasing. And then think about like the protein sparing modified fast. The component of a protein sparing modified fast is high protein. So it's lean protein sources, whole foods. It is fibrous carbohydrate sources that are like it's cruciferous vegetables, things like that, non-starchy carbohydrates. And then it is fish oil. So it's a higher fiber diet. Like I was eating 50 to 60 plus grams of fiber per day. So that's more gut residue. So my weight would be thrown off from that. So yes, I do see that. But that is where your experience has to come and play. You have to know what is my actual visuals because I don't care what the scale weight reads. I care what I look like. And so it's, me taking visual progression pictures both in my normal lighting as well as at the gym where I know that I have specific lighting that I've used dozens of times over again. It's also skin, like I don't use skin calipers, but I use actual the skin thickness of my abdomen, of my thighs, of my quadriceps, of my arms. Like I know certain areas, how it should feel and how the skin should actually feel. When I like peel back my skin, I could see how thick it is. And it's essentially like taking a caliper. I see when it's going down significantly. And I also can tell when there's water in between like the subcutaneous tissue. And that would be a sign of water retention. So you start looking more visually. And that's also something that I had to learn from bodybuilding because ultimately, unless you're in a weight class, they don't care what you weigh. They don't care what your body fat is. They care what you look like. What do you look like in your poses? And this is essentially an illusion. So really, when I look at conditioning, it's a lot of a visual process that I'm trying to get myself to a place I know I've been before. And then this year I did a comparative analysis with how I felt. And I'll tell you, last year when I was at the same point, I felt far worse by this point in the diet than I did this time. But this is a continuous evolution of a process. So I did it this way. I'll do it another time, a different way next time. You know what I mean? But this is all about collecting data. I'm very objective with the data that I track. And then my biggest thing is I would never ask a client to do something that I have not done or would not do. And so it really is about staying in the trenches, trialing things on myself, obviously looking into the research and reading research and really getting an evidence-based perspective. But evidence-based does not just mean reading papers or just your personal anecdote. It's about combining the two. It's about combining what you see in the evidence and the best available evidence at that, then also the clinical experience, which for us is as a coach, and then the preferences, the lifestyle, the abilities, and then the constraints of the client that you're working with. So if I have someone that is running a multi-million-dollar company and it's a tech executive that's flying all over the place and can't hardly do cardio or can't do steps, this is not an applicable method for them. But I will tell you that I have a cyclist right now that this is a perfect method for him. And as I've done this and he's seen my progression, he wants to try it. So these are things that then I can not only speak to him from the evidence itself, but also from experience. And that's a level of relatability within coaching that a lot of people are lacking.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And you take that guy that is busy, you're going to find ways to maybe build in a little bit of movement throughout his day
100%.
just to help get it up, right? And whatnot. Yeah, man, no, I totally agree. And I know that was one of the things we wanted to talk about today, but I feel like we kind of were able to weave that in and out throughout the conversation, everything like that, man. But I could talk to you for a lot longer on this topic, but I know that we both got to get going here. It was a good conversation, man. Love diving into all this with you and learning about your fat loss phase and what you implemented there. We'll obviously do this again, but before I let you go, where can the audience find you and you have anything coming out on your end?
Absolutely, Jeff. First and foremost, my friend, I appreciate you having me on. I'm really looking forward to getting out to North Carolina next week and us connecting in person. We definitely let's schedule a part 2 because I want to go over evidence-based coaching and then also intuitive versus informed eating because I know you wanted to tackle those topics, so we'll definitely do that. And then for the audience, the best place to find me is on Instagram at Brandon DaCruz_. You guys can email me. That's the best place to reach me from, communicative capacity. And that is bdacruzfitness@gmail.com. And then if you're a podcast listener and you like Jeff's podcast, I definitely suggest you check out my podcast, which is called the Chasing Clarity Health and Fitness Podcast, which is available on Spotify and iTunes.
And I think you've had Eric Helms on the last couple, you've had a few Eric Helms.
I just had a 2-part series with Eric Helms.
Awesome. Yeah. And again, you always have a ton of great guests as well too. I know like again, Lyle McDonald, I know he's been on there a lot recently as well too. So always a ton of great guests on there, man. So yeah, we'll definitely schedule part two. And then yeah, man, looking forward to meeting up next week. And yep, we'll get you on again soon, dude. Thanks for coming on.